So we're gonna make two different styles of sweater pumpkin today. We're gonna do a sweater pumpkin with a tassel attached on it like this. So it's more of a soft pumpkin all the way around. You can make these fairly large and then use them as pillows on your couch. Or you can just use them as a decorative pumpkin that's cozy looking and softer. And then we're also gonna make a sweater pumpkin that has like a stem on it. So this is a other type of pumpkin, maybe a little bit more traditional like you've seen before. So the easiest way to make these sweater pumpkins is to start with the sleeve of the sweater and just cut off an area of the sweater that's about 8 to 10 inches, probably closer to 8 inches, but if you want to be conservative, you could cut off a full 10 inches of your sweater. And you can also use the rest of the sweater by creating a similar tube. If you just fold the sweater material over like I'm doing on this middle part of the sweater, and then cut out a rectangle that is about 16 inches by the 8 to 10 inches. And then you'll just take that rectangle. I'll open it up here so you can see what it looks like. So this is just a portion of the sweater that's not the sleeve. Just fold it in half and then just sew a seam along the open end. And then you're going to end up with something very similar to the sleeve of the sweater, and you can use that for your pumpkin as well. And you can make this as big or as small as you want. You could actually use the entire sweater and just sew up the sides of it and make a very large pumpkin, or you can just keep it smaller like I'm doing with this one. It's probably, like I mentioned, closer to 16 by 8 inches. And then I'm going to just take my sewing machine, and like I mentioned, I'm going to sew a seam on that open end. And because it's sweater material, I like to use a zigzag stitch, and I do about a size 3 stitch. And then I just run, like I said, that running stitch along that open end of the sweater. And this is just on the parts of the sweater that are not the sleeve, because obviously on the sleeve you already have two sides that are sewn together like a tube, like the sleeve makes. But I just wanted to show you how you can make multiple pumpkins out of the same sweater, not just from the sleeve. You can use the entire sweater and make at least 10 to 15 pumpkins just from one sweater. So if you can just sew a stitch on one side of the rectangular part of the sweater, then you have another pumpkin to make. So it's pretty neat and handy. If you're just making a couple, then of course the sleeves are probably the easiest way to make them. If you want to make a giant pumpkin, just sew up all parts of the sweater till you have a rectangle and then make a giant pumpkin. And I still plan to try that sometime this fall. So now we have our tubes, and now we're ready to start making our sweater pumpkins, at least the base of them anyway. So I'm going to use this tube that I just sewed and turn it inside out so that we can start closing up the other ends to make our pumpkin. So to start making the pumpkin, we're just going to use some embroidery thread. Now you want to match the thread to your sweater material. I have a cream sweater. I'm going to use this white thread, and that's probably close enough. But you want to match your embroidery thread to your sweater material. And then just go ahead and cut off a section about 12 to 18 inches long. Tie a knot on one end, and then we're going to just thread the embroidery thread into our needle. And the needle size is important. You want a big enough needle so that it's going to be able to go through the pumpkin once we have it stuffed. So I actually like using doll needles. For really big pumpkins, I also have used an upholstery needle. So you want a long needle. You don't want a short needle for going through the sweater pumpkins. You want a nice big needle. So to start, I'm going to take one of the open ends. And again, my sweater is inside out at this point. And I'm just going to do a stitch in and out on one of the ends. So I'm stitching about a 1/2 inch down, and then I'm just stitching every 1/2 to 5/8 inch and just going in and out of my sweater sleeve or tube here. And then once I have gone through the entire length of the opening, then I'm going to just pull my embroidery thread tight, and you just pull it as tight as you can to get a nice cinch. And this is going to be the bottom of our pumpkin, so we want to close it up pretty tight. And then just to really finalize the cinch, I'm going to go through the middle of it 3 or 4 times just to really get a nice tight cinch, and this will just make your pumpkin that much sturdier and just that much higher quality, so it will last you from year to year. And then once I'm done doing that, then I just take my thread and I tie it off. I do 4 or 5 knots just to give it a nice tight finish to it, and then just go ahead and cut off any extra thread that you have after you've tied it off. Now I'm going to go ahead and turn my pumpkin right side out, and after I started making this pumpkin, I realized this sweater was a little bit too loose of the weave. You see how you can see the holes? I don't usually like using that type of sweater with making these, just because then the rice and the polyfill can stick out through those holes. So when you are looking for a sweater, you want to make sure that you find one that is pretty comfy and stretchy, but also has a pretty tight weave. You don't want a lot of holes showing through unless you're stuffing it with something other than polyfill and rice. But if you're using those regular fillers, you're not going to want to be able to see that in your pumpkin. So I think it'll be okay, but I probably would recommend using a sweater that has a tighter weave even than I'm using today. So I filled the bottom of my pumpkin with the rice, and then I usually use about 1/4 cup of rice to 1/2 cup. And then I stuff the rest of the pumpkin with the polyfill, and I do stuff it quite full. I like to start shaping my pumpkin when I'm stuffing the polyfill in there. If you made your rectangle a little taller, your pumpkin might appear too tall. So really, at this point, you want to kind of get the shape of your pumpkin set up. So I like to just stuff it until it's nice and full, but I also like to round it out to kind of see what the ultimate shape of it will be. I don't want it to be too high, and some fabrics respond differently to making the sections of the pumpkin. If it's a stretchy sweater that's pretty soft, you're not going to have any trouble making really nice sections. If it's a little sturdier sweater, then you might want to not fill it as full, just so you have a little more definition when you pull the embroidery thread tight to make the sections. I hope that makes sense, but if you have any questions, let me know. Basically, you just want to start seeing the shape of your pumpkin, and if you made the rectangle a little larger, like closer to the 10 inches, just try to shape the pumpkin into the type of pumpkin that you want to make. You don't want it to be too tall or too short. You just want it to start looking like a pumpkin. So now that I've filled my pumpkin, then I'm going to just take, again, 12 to 18 inches of the embroidery thread. I'm just going to thread my needle here. I tied it off already, and then I'm just going to do a running stitch around the other end, so go in and out. And again, I'm going to go down actually an 1.5 inches about, or to 2 inches, because I don't want that extra height on my pumpkin. I want it to be a nice round shape. So I'm actually going to plan to cut off about 2 inches of the top of the sweater sleeve. And then my pumpkin will be more the shape that I'm going for, which is more of the round, typical pumpkin look. So just take your thread and close up that top end by going in and out I was going to say a 1/2 inch down, but like I mentioned, it's closer to 2 inches on this one, and then just go in every 1.5 inches. And then once you have a stitch all around the top of the pumpkin, we're going to cinch it closed and then cut off any extra fabric on the top. And just like on the underside, on the top side, I do like to go through the center still several times after it's cinched up. The sweater material is really thick, so it can pull the thread a little bit and make a looser cinch. So I like to just take my needle and thread, go through the middle in several different places, just kind of wrapping the the thread a little bit around the cinch, and then closing it up even tighter, and that gives it a nice close again, and you won't have the thread pulling away as much. So I'm just going to cut off my extra fabric here. I won't need that any longer, and just be careful when you're doing that not to cut the embroidery thread. So that's another thing when you are, I guess, going through the center of that cinch, make sure it's close to the bottom of the opening, because then if you cut away any extra fabric, you don't want to cut the thread with it. So once I have a nice tight cinch, then I usually just tie off the thread at that point. I'm going to pull it through the center of the bottom, and this way you can kind of pull down some of that leftover fabric on the top. You can pull it down a little bit and invert it into the pumpkin, and then just tie off your thread. And again, use 4 or 5 knots just to make sure that it's very tight and secure. And then once you've tied your knot, just cut off any extra thread that you have. And then now we really have the base of our pumpkin. So our next step is to make the pumpkin sections. I usually like to make 6 different sections on these sweater pumpkins. So you're going to take a little bit longer piece of embroidery thread this time, maybe 24 to 30 inches, and then tie off your embroidery thread like you did before and thread your needle. And then we're just going to go in and out the middle of the pumpkin and wrap the embroidery thread around the pumpkin to create sections. So start by just poking your needle through the middle of the top of the pumpkin and then pushing it through until it comes out the center of the bottom of the pumpkin. And this is where the larger needle comes into play. It can be kind of tricky to pull it through if you don't have a large enough needle. So take that embroidery thread, wrap it around one of the sides of the pumpkin, and then go back down through the center of the top of the pumpkin, pulling the needle through the bottom center, and then just wrap the thread again around another part of the pumpkin. And we're just creating the sections of the pumpkin. So like I mentioned, we're going to do this 6 different times. We start by, again, poking it through the top, pulling it through the entire pumpkin, and coming back out the bottom. And as you're doing this, you really do want to pull your thread pretty tight. This sweater I'm using is fairly old, and the material is not as responsive to my thread as I would like it to be, but you should get nice plump sections at this point. Just pulling the thread as tight as you can. I have had times when the embroidery thread breaks just because I'm pulling it so tight. It's kind of annoying, but it is worth it to get the nice tight look. You can actually use dental floss also to do this, and dental floss can be a little sturdier and you can pull it a little tighter even than the embroidery floss, but it is white. So if you're worried about it showing on a darker fabric, then you probably don't want to use it. And the embroidery floss does work fine. You just have to be careful when you're pulling it tight that the thread doesn't break. And now that once you've pulled all your 6 sections tight, then just go ahead and tie off your embroidery thread. I usually like to come through the top and then just tie the knot on the top 4 or 5 times, and then cut off any extra thread that you have. Now it's time to finish our pumpkin. So there's 2 different ways to do this, as I mentioned. One is just using a stem that you might have on hand. So I have a bunch of dried pumpkin stems. A lot of my pumpkins I finish with real pumpkin stems. And then I take some covered wire like this brown wire I have here. I wrap it around a pencil multiple times, and I just get a nice pumpkin curl. And so once I wrapped it around the pencil, then I have this little curl, and I can use that on the top of the pumpkin along with the stem. So I'm just going to look for a stem here that I like. I have a bunch of different colors, and I think a darker green would look good with this white. So I'm going to use that one for my stem. And then to make leaves, I have used a variety of things. I use felt, or I like to actually use leather off of old clothes or hats or bags even that I find at garage sales or thrift stores. It's a great way to use leather. I'm going to use actually leather from this bag today, and I just cut out a leaf shape, and you can do this kind of however you want, but just create several different leaves that can be hot glued onto the top of our pumpkin. So here's one here, and then I'll do a second one. And then once I like the way it looks, then I just usually hot glue the stem, the leaves, and the curls in place. And this gives you a really cute little sweater pumpkin. But today I also want to show you a second method, which is making the tassels on top of the pumpkin. And this is a cute little look that I actually first saw in Pottery Barn. They used it for pumpkin pillows, and I wanted to reproduce it at a cheaper cost, so I created this other option for finishing our pumpkins, and we'll do the tassel pumpkins next. So with a white pumpkin, there are ways to do a cheating tassel, which would be to use this nautical rope from the Dollar Tree. You could just cut off a chunk of that, and you could attach it on the top, and it would be kind of like the tassel. So you could do that if you have a white or light colored pumpkin. You could also use some chunky yarn as a tassel on top of your pumpkin. And again, just cut off a chunk and attach it on the top. So that would be a really easy way to make a tassel if you could find yarn that matches your pumpkin top. So if you want to make a legitimate tassel, you're going to take yarn, and I have this linen comfy classic yarn from Yarn Bee, and it's a nice smooth yarn, and I think it'll make a nice tassel on here. And just keep in mind, you probably want to pick a yarn that matches the color of your pumpkin, especially if you're doing like a pillow or something, you want it to match. Otherwise, you could do it more like the color of a stem, I suppose, as well. But I'm going to match the color of my yarn with my sweater for today. So we're going to start by just taking a piece of cardboard that is 12 inches in length, and the type of yarn you use might cause some variations in the length of the yarn you're going to be using, but for this yarn it's pretty stretchy actually, so I'm going to wrap my yarn around a piece of cardboard that is 12 inches in length. And you want to wrap the yarn 10 to 15 times around the cardboard, and then once you have it wrapped, then we're going to hold on to the yarn so that the revolutions of the yarn are kind of still in place, and we're going to slip it off of the cardboard. And then I'm going to lay it down on the table here, and then I'm going to cut a string that's 6 to 8 inches long, and I'm just going to tie a knot around our loops of yarn and just tie it nice and tight in the center of the loops. And then go ahead and take your scissors, and we're going to cut off the loop ends on both sides so that we're forming a tassel for our pumpkin. And I didn't show that super great, but I cut off all the loops so that now I just have the yarn kind of free hanging, I guess. And then I'm going to take all the yarn and I'm going to make it 3 sections, and I'm just going to braid it. So divide your yarn into 3 different sections and then braid the yarn, and so you have this little braided tassel. And then once you finish braiding it, take a little piece of the yarn, like 8 inches, I guess, and then you're just going to tie off the bottom of the tassel with another piece of yarn. So this is going to hold your braid in place. I'm just going to tie a knot here, the bottom, and you can make these tassels as long as you want. So you could do a longer piece of yarn, maybe 18 to 24 inches, so that you have more wiggle room with your tassel. And then I just like trimming off the ends of my tassel so that they're all the same length and that it just looks nice and rounded. And then here's my tassel. So that's all there is to making these braided tassels. And what we're going to do now to attach it onto the pumpkin is either take a piece of the yarn that you were using, or take your embroidery thread and needle again, which is what I'm going to do today. And just again, knot your yarn, or knot your thread and thread your needle, and then we're just going to pull the embroidery floss through the center of the tassel, attaching it onto the pumpkin. So once I finish knotting it here, then we're just going to take our needle and we're going to pull it through the center of the tassel and then bring it through the pumpkin. And you might start seeing a pattern here. I like to make sure it's really well attached, so I'm going to pull my needle and thread back up through the center of the pumpkin, and I'm going to come down again through that tassel in several different spots so that I have a really secure attachment onto my pumpkin. And just tie off your thread on the bottom of the pumpkin. Again, do it 2 to 3 times just so you get a nice secure knot, and then we're just going to cut off any extra thread that we have left over. And there you have it. This is our tassel pumpkin, which can double as a pumpkin pillow if you make them large enough, or just to use in your home decor. And they're super soft and cozy, and I really like them. They are a unique look for a pumpkin, but it's really cozy for fall, and I hope you enjoyed making them. If you have any questions, please let me know. I'm happy to help even after the class. Happy to answer additional questions you have as they come up. So thank you so much for joining us. I hope you enjoy making them, and I love to see what your finished products are. So go ahead and email me pictures of your pumpkins at elizabeth@awellpurposewoman.com. I'm sorry about any confusion with scheduling from our last class, but I really appreciate you joining us, and I hope that you will enjoy making these sweater pumpkins for fall.